Beneath the elegant facade and glittering parties at Fairmont Crest, unspoken secrets smoldered in the hearts of those who had once walked together as family. Vernon had long been a symbol of power and refinement in the black elite community, but whether as a politician who had won 3 elections or as the stern patriarch of the Dupree dynasty, he could not escape one bitter truth: his family was always drawn into dangers he himself lacked the courage to confront fully. Bill, the former son-in-law he had once publicly rejected, was the very man he summoned on that fog-shrouded morning after hearing that Martin had been brutalized by Kenneth. Kenneth, who had seemed so harmless, nothing more than a dutiful servant, had suddenly revealed a chillingly violent, deranged nature when he locked Martin away and tormented the boy in a fit of delusion born of twisted ideals. The incident not only shattered Vernon's belief in the control he once thought unshakable, but also forced him to dig up a terrible memory buried 2 years earlier, when he and Bill had conspired in an act they both swore never to speak of again. Though he had once sworn he would never trust Bill again, when danger came knocking and threatened the honor of the Dupree name, Vernon knew there was only one man ruthless enough, cold enough, and shrewd enough to handle what the law could not touch. Bill had once been Danny's husband, once sat as an unofficial member of the family, once occupied a seat of honor at charity galas, but he had also been cast out from behind the iron gates of Fairmont like a stranger. No one ever said it aloud, but they all understood. Bill's love for Danny had not been enough to keep him there, and Vernon's pride had never allowed forgiveness when a man wounded his daughter. Yet fate, with its cruel irony, had forced these estranged men who seemed to have nothing left to say to one another to meet again. When Bill stepped into the golf lounge, the private room where Vernon had summoned him, the air immediately thickened. Bill needed no reminder that he was not welcome. Vernon's hollow stare betrayed unease and fear. He was no longer the booming statesman before the public, but a father desperate to preserve the life of a grandson scarred by trauma. Yet Bill had not come out of pity. He had come because he knew he held power. After all, it was Vernon who had dialed his number. A call without greeting, only 3 clipped words: "I need you." Before Vernon could even speak, Bill set the terms. If Vernon wanted his help, then conditions had to be met immediately. First, Bill demanded clear, public acknowledgement that he and Hayley, his current wife, once Naomi's closest friend, had the right to enter Fairmont as any other member of the family. No watchful stares. No whispers behind their backs. No indirect contempt in seating arrangements or service. Bill was tired of being treated as an outsider, even after he had helped Vernon erase evidence of a financial scandal years ago. Respect was no longer a privilege. It was a prerequisite. Vernon could not hide his shock at what sounded like an audacious demand. To him, Hayley had always been the intruder, first as Naomi's companion, now as Bill's wife, someone who unsettled the traditions and cohesion of the Dupree name. He had never liked her, not out of personal malice, but because she represented change he could not accept. Yet, faced with Bill's unyielding conditions, Vernon knew refusal was not an option. In the long silence that followed, old memories returned like a murder of crows crying on the rooftop. 2 years earlier, Bill had helped Vernon silence a witness in a city housing board corruption scandal. It had not been murder, but it had been deception of the highest order: false papers, altered testimony, and a large bribe passed with no trace. After that, Bill withdrew from the world of the fixer. He declared his intent to practice law honorably, to build a family with Hayley, to step out of the shadows into the light. But men who had tasted the power of darkness rarely left it behind for good. Now, with Kenneth in custody and the police broadening their investigation, Vernon feared that saving Martin might reopen the gates of hell they had once sealed. There was something about Kenneth Vernon could not yet speak of, perhaps a link to the old network, perhaps a man once paid to keep quiet. But with Kenneth's sudden death, his body discovered in the park just a night after Martin was saved, everything seemed beyond control. Vernon suspected Bill's hand in it, but he did not dare ask directly. For if it was true, then once again he owed a man he had disowned. The tension between them rose like a tide. Vernon, though reluctant, finally nodded. He agreed to host a ceremony at Fairmont Crest to formally present Bill and Hayley as friends of the family. He would make a speech himself, erase every trace of hostility, open the iron gates once more, this time without conditions. But he warned Bill that if another death ever touched him again, Vernon would not stand by his side. Bill smiled, a smile not of triumph, but of acceptance. He knew Vernon's acceptance was a mere formality. Trust was broken, honor was stained. But every fixer knows the truth: it does not matter if you are loved. It only matters if you are needed. And in that moment, Bill was once again the one man Vernon could not replace. When Bill left the room, his shadow merged with the fading afternoon light on the Fairmont lawn. Vernon stood alone, clutching a half-empty glass of wine, his gaze not fixed on the present but cast toward an uncertain future. He knew that each time he opened the door for Bill, he closed another door within himself, the door to a life clean of bargains and compromises. Yet he also knew that in a world riddled with schemes and threats like Fairmont Crest, men like Bill could never truly be cast aside. They could only be summoned at the exact moment they were needed. In the glittering yet treacherous world of Fairmont Crest, no demand was ever made without a hidden purpose. When Bill suddenly insisted on public respect and full acceptance of Hayley within the elite community, it was not a polite request, it was a direct strike at Vernon's pride. A man like Vernon, who had built the Dupree family's stature on authority and absolute control, was unaccustomed to bending before anyone, least of all a man he had once cast aside. To Vernon, that demand was a bitter reminder that his grip on power was no longer absolute. Yet it was also a warning. Without shrewd compromise in moments of crisis, he stood to lose far more than wounded pride. Deep down, Vernon understood this was not a simple negotiation between two men once tied by marriage. It was a battle between past and present, between the ingrained pride of a generation that had long dominated and the quiet rise of those once dismissed as outsiders. Bill was no longer the young son-in-law who bowed to Vernon's every decree. He had remade himself into a man who knew the worth of power and how to seize it. His demand was not only about Hayley's rightful place, it was also a way of forcing Vernon to acknowledge that Bill could no longer be erased as he once had been. At the same time, Vernon was confronting another crisis: Leslie Thomas. Draped in a veneer of moral superiority, she had become the wedge that drove Nicole and Ted's marriage to the brink. Once a friend, an advisor, an indispensable figure in the philanthropic programs Vernon had sponsored, Leslie's quiet but relentless ambition had corroded the fragile bonds of his family. Nicole's divorce was not just a private heartbreak, it was a strike against the model image Vernon had carefully crafted for the Dupree legacy. Leslie's name had become a glaring crack in the very structure of power Vernon was desperate to preserve. Thus, when Vernon weighed whether to hand Bill the task of cleaning up Leslie, it was no rash impulse. It was the cold calculation of a man who had long used people as chess pieces. Bill had handled worse before: disappearing witnesses, bending laws until they broke, and Vernon knew he had both the skill and the motive to deal with Leslie. The real question was not what Bill could do, but what Vernon truly wanted. He did not need a sensational scandal, nor police lights flashing at midnight. What he required was a quiet resolution. Effective, acceptable on the surface. If Leslie were to suddenly seek peace or start anew somewhere far from Fairmont, no one would probe too deeply. But Vernon was careful not to lay all his cards on the table at once. Among the secrets he guarded, one was far more valuable: proof of Hayley's fabricated past. Locked in his private office was a folder detailing how Hayley had once faked a pregnancy in a desperate attempt to hold on to a powerful man, a man with whom Vernon himself had collaborated on a charity project. When her scheme failed and the supposed child vanished in a staged miscarriage, she severed ties and buried the episode under the mask of a perfect persona. Yet Vernon had preserved every trace: falsified medical records, a chain of emails, even a covert recording. He had never used these files, not because he lacked the nerve, but because he knew a card only held power so long as it remained unplayed. He understood that exposing the truth would destroy not just Hayley but Bill as well, stripping away the one moral foundation Bill still clung to: the belief that his wife was unlike the schemers he despised. But Vernon also knew that if Bill ever became too difficult to control, if his demands pressed too far, then one meeting with a local editor or one anonymous email to a regional news outlet would be enough to shatter it all. The central question was this: what would Vernon do? Would he sacrifice the family's honor to cling to absolute authority? Or would he yield to Bill's terms, preserving outward peace while secretly laying traps? The answer was not in what Vernon said, but in what he withheld. By entrusting Bill with Leslie, he signaled faith in his capability, but by keeping Hayley's file intact, he confirmed that their alliance, however useful, rested always on suspicion. Their silence became an unspoken contract. Vernon knew he was playing a long game. Bill knew every move he made was under watch. And as Leslie continued to stride confidently through Fairmont's marble halls, oblivious to the storm forming behind her, somewhere in the shadows two men, once family, once enemies, were plotting together to cleanse a kingdom neither could truly call home, yet neither could allow another to control. Vernon had never believed in coincidence. In his world, everything was calculated, the words spoken, the clasp of a handshake, the glance that lingered too long, all of it could become the spark for an unseen chain of movements stirring beneath the surface. So when Bill reappeared at Fairmont Crest, not as a family member, but as a man carrying conditions, Vernon knew the old order had just been broken, and a new one was taking shape. Bill's return was not simply to assist, nor to confront. It was the clearest sign yet that the gates Vernon had slammed shut years ago had swung open again, not by his will, but by circumstance. And once opened, no one could predict what would walk in alongside the man who had returned, not only carrying the memory of old bargains, but now determined to write the rules himself. When Bill demanded that he and Hayley be publicly and unconditionally recognized within Fairmont Crest, Vernon realized he was being pushed to the outer edge of concession. To another, such a demand might have seemed reasonable. But to Vernon, it was a stinging reminder that the walls of tradition and authority he had built were cracking, and those he had once cast out were now insisting on stepping into the very center. In that moment, he complied. He compromised. He yielded. But he did not forget. For Vernon had never compromised without preparing a counterstroke. Meanwhile, Leslie still wandered freely through the carpeted halls of Fairmont Crest, as though nothing had happened, as though she were not the very reason Nicole's marriage had collapsed, as though she had not whispered her poisonous counsel into Ted's ear during the last year of their union. Vernon needed no evidence to know who stood behind the damage. He understood Leslie's ways, subtle, deft, leaving no trace but always producing results. While others were still lamenting the fall of a picture-perfect couple, Vernon was already planning to sweep Leslie off the board. He needed someone who could do it without detonating the house. He needed someone like Bill. Their second arrangement began in silence. Few words were required. Both understood that the goal was not to destroy, but to dim. Leslie had to leave the city not by scandal, but by what looked like personal choice. An enticing offer for work elsewhere. A shadowy phone call carrying veiled threats. A moment that stripped her of the community's sponsorship. And if necessary, the looming specter of a defamation suit waiting should she dare remain another day. Bill had executed such maneuvers before, and this time he needed no instruction. Yet as he took the assignment, Vernon quietly drew another card from the hidden archive he had guarded for years, the file on Hayley. To anyone else, the folder was just a collection of papers. But to Vernon, it was the silver bullet that could make Bill retreat forever. Proof that Hayley had once falsified medical records to fabricate a pregnancy, then staged a miscarriage to conceal her lie. All of it was in Vernon's possession, not to be used immediately, but to be used when the moment was right. He didn't need to tell Bill. He only needed him to know, somehow, that Vernon was always a step ahead. If Bill betrayed him, if he pushed too far, if he wielded his newfound standing to shake the foundation Vernon fought to preserve, then with one pull of the trigger, Bill's entire world would collapse like a sandcastle at the tide. But what Vernon could not foresee was that Bill, too, had begun collecting secrets. Quiet conversations with Martin. Recordings of private meetings. Subtle irregularities in council votes that only an insider would notice. Together they painted a different portrait, a Vernon who was not perfect, not invincible. A Vernon who had erred, who had bent ethics, who had traded honor for power. And if those secrets ever came to light, it would not only be Hayley who fell, but Vernon himself would lose the very authority he had spent a lifetime preserving. The game was no longer about Leslie, nor about Hayley, nor even Nicole and Ted. It had become a silent yet ferocious duel between two men who had once been bound as family. One who had built the system, and one who had learned how to dismantle it from within. And between them lay only silence, a silence thick and weighted, like the darkness before a storm. Who would move first? Who would break the balance? Who would play the killing card when the water rose to their chins? From the outside, Fairmont Crest still seemed serene, unchanged. But inside, beneath the heavy drapes and warm golden light, an unnamed war had begun to smolder where every promise was conditional, every agreement carried a price, and everyone, even Vernon himself, had something to lose.